Somewhere in the Nevada desert, about 83 miles northwest of Las Vegas, there is a place with no official address. It doesn't appear on most maps. For decades, the United States government didn't even acknowledge it existed. And yet, for as long as most of us can remember, it has occupied a very specific corner of the human imagination. A corner filled with questions, with shadows, and with stories that never quite go away. The place is called Area 51. Today we're going to spend a few hours walking through everything people have ever said about it. The famous theories, the strange ones, the ones that have been around for decades, and the ones that only exist in the quieter parts of the internet. We'll look at what the government has actually confirmed, what remains genuinely unexplained, and what it is about this particular patch of desert that has captured so many curious minds for so long. Let's start at the beginning. The grounding. What Area 51 actually is the official name, according to the United States government, is the Nevada Test and Training Range, more specifically, a detachment of Edwards Air Force Base, sometimes referred to as Homey Airport, or by its coordinates on old Atomic Energy Commission land use maps, Area 51. It sits on the southern shore of a dry lakebed called Groom Lake. The lakebed is flat, white, and almost perfectly level, the kind of surface that from the air looks almost artificial, like something built rather than formed by nature over thousands of years. In the right light, at the right angle, it seems to shimmer. Pilots who flew over it in the early days of the Cold War described it as a mirror set into the desert floor. The surrounding terrain doesn't offer much comfort. The Mojave and Great Basin deserts meet somewhere out there in the scrubland and rocky ridgelines of southern Nevada, and the result is one of the more inhospitable stretches of land in the continental United States. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees. There is very little water. There is very little of anything, really, which is precisely what made it useful. The land surrounding the base is restricted. There are fences, perimeter fences with motion sensors, and beyond those, additional boundaries marked only by orange posts driven into the soil at regular intervals. There are signs. They are not subtle. They inform visitors in plain language that the use of deadly force is authorized, that photography is prohibited, and that trespassers will be prosecuted under federal law. The signs don't invite questions. They close them. And for a very long time, there were no official explanations for any of it. The base covers a significant footprint. Estimates vary depending on how you define the secured perimeter, but the restricted area extends across several hundred square miles of desert terrain. There are runways, long ones, longer than almost any civilian airport in the world. The main runway at Groom Lake stretches for well over 2 miles. Whatever was meant to land there, it was built for speed, or for size, or for both. There are hangars, there are administrative buildings, water towers, and what appear to be underground structures, though their depth and purpose remain matters of some speculation. Satellite imagery taken over the decades shows a facility that has quietly expanded, new buildings appearing where there were none, old ones modified or demolished. The physical footprint shifting in ways that suggest ongoing, active use. None of this is especially secret anymore, at least in outline. The CIA officially acknowledged the base's existence in 2013. Declassified documents confirmed what many had long suspected, that it was used for the development and testing of advanced aircraft, beginning in the 1950s with the U-2 reconnaissance plane. It is, in many ways, a real place with a real history. But that history was hidden for so long that the stories people invented to fill the silence took on a life entirely their own. The early years, the origins of the base trace back to the early 1950s, a time when the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in what would become known as the Cold War, a decades-long tension between two superpowers, each watching the other very, very carefully. It was a war fought not with armies on open fields, but with intelligence, with technology, and with secrets. And one of the most pressing secrets was simple. Neither side could see what the other was doing. American intelligence officials needed to know what was happening inside Soviet territory. They needed to see factory floors, missile installations, airfields, and naval yards from a distance, without being detected, without starting a war. The solution they developed was an aircraft called the U-2. The U-2 was a remarkable piece of engineering. Slender and strange-looking, it resembled a powered glider more than a military aircraft. Long, delicate wings stretching out from a narrow fuselage, built to carry as little weight as possible while climbing as high as it could go. It could fly at altitudes far beyond what any Soviet radar or missile system of the time could reliably reach. 70,000 feet, nearly 14 miles above the Earth's surface. At that height, the sky above shades into something closer to black, and the curvature of the planet becomes faintly, quietly visible. From that altitude, the U-2's cameras could photograph objects on the ground with remarkable clarity: roads, buildings, vehicles, the long shadows of missile silos at dawn. It could cover thousands of miles of Soviet territory in a single flight. And it needed somewhere to be developed, tested, and flown. Somewhere remote, somewhere flat, somewhere that almost no one would ever accidentally wander into. Groom Lake was chosen in 1955. The CIA, working with Lockheed's Secretive Design Division, a group that would come to be nicknamed the Skunk Works, after a running joke among its engineers, set up operations there quietly and almost completely out of public view. Workers were flown in, housing was built, a runway was laid across the flat white surface of the lake bed, and the aircraft that would define a generation of American intelligence gathering began its test flights over the Nevada desert. What followed was decades of classified aviation work, each chapter stranger and more ambitious than the last. The U-2 gave way to the A-12 Oxcart, faster, sleeker, capable of outrunning almost anything in the sky. The Oxcart informed the SR-71 Blackbird, which would hold speed records for decades. Later came the F-117, the first operational stealth aircraft, a plane so angular and unusual in shape that it seemed to belong to a different era entirely. Each of these aircraft, in their time, represented the absolute leading edge of what was technically possible. And each of them, at some point during testing, was seen by someone who had no idea what they were looking at. A strange shape, moving fast, behaving in ways no known aircraft should be able to behave. And that's where the stories begin. When people started asking questions for most of the Cold War era, Area 51 existed in a kind of legal and informational grey zone. It was real, present on certain maps, visible from certain angles, occasionally referenced in documents that had been partially declassified and then just as quickly forgotten. But it had no official name, no public mission statement, and no spokesperson willing to answer even the most basic questions about what went on there. People who lived in Nevada could sometimes see strange lights in the sky at night, not the slow, steady movement of commercial aircraft, not the blinking rhythm of a helicopter. These were lights that accelerated, suddenly, sharply, and then stopped. Lights that moved in straight lines and then turned at angles that suggested something other than conventional aerodynamics. Ranchers in the surrounding counties reported them. Truckers on the long, empty highways reported them. Some of them reported the same thing independently, in the same general area on the same general nights. Pilots on commercial flight paths occasionally reported objects that didn't match anything in the official record. These reports were logged, filed, and generally went nowhere. The standard response, when there was one, was measured and uninformative. The objects were described as weather phenomena, or optical illusions, or simply unidentified, which technically was true, and which explained nothing. Former workers at the base added another layer of quiet unease, bound by secrecy agreements that were, by most accounts, taken extremely seriously. They said very little. But occasionally, in conversation, at a dinner table, at a bar, in the careful pauses of an interview, they would hint. They would suggest that what they had worked on was stranger than anything the public had ever seen. Not in specifics, just in tone. Just in the particular way a person chooses their words when they know which ones to leave out. The government, for its part, said almost nothing. Official inquiries were met with non-answers. Freedom of information requests came back heavily redacted, or simply denied on national security grounds. The base, officially, did not exist. The lights, officially, had explanations. The explanations, officially, were not available for review. That silence created a vacuum, and nature, as it tends to, filled it. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, a slowly growing community of researchers, writers, and curious observers began paying close attention to the Nevada desert. They were not, for the most part, people on the fringes. Some were former military, some were engineers, some were journalists with backgrounds in investigative reporting who had simply noticed that a very large piece of federal land was generating a very unusual volume of unexplained activity. They watched the skies from public land just outside the restricted boundary. They filed requests, they compared notes, they built, carefully and patiently, a picture of something. Though what that something was remained genuinely unclear. By the 1980s, the questions had grown louder, the community had grown larger, and the government's silence, rather than discouraging interest, had begun to feel like confirmation of something. And then, in 1989, everything changed. Bob Lazar and the moment everything changed on May 15th. 1989, a man named Robert Scott Lazar appeared on a local Las Vegas television station and told a story that would, in many ways, define the public conversation about Area 51 for the next several decades. He was introduced under a pseudonym, Dennis, and his face was kept in shadow. He spoke quietly. He didn't perform. And what he said was, by any measure, extraordinary. Lazar claimed to have worked at a facility he called S4, a site he described as located a short distance south of the main Groom Lake complex, built into the side of a mountain range, with hangar doors designed to blend into the surrounding rock face. He said the facility was accessible only through a carefully managed transportation system, that security protocols were unlike anything he had encountered before, and that the work being conducted there was entirely unlike anything in the public domain. He said that at S4 he had been employed as a physicist, tasked with understanding, and eventually replicating, the propulsion system of an extraterrestrial spacecraft. Not one spacecraft. Several, 9 by his count, in various states of condition and study. He described the craft in detail. Disc-shaped. Smooth, no visible seams or fasteners. Materials that didn't respond to standard analysis in the ways terrestrial metals would. He described the propulsion system as operating on principles that fell outside conventional physics. Something involving an element he referred to as element 115, which at the time of his interview did not appear on the periodic table. Years later, in 2003, an element with that atomic number was synthesized and officially named Moscovium. Lazar noted this quietly, without drama, when asked about it. He described documents he claimed to have read, briefing papers that outlined not just the existence of extraterrestrial craft, but a longer history of contact, going back decades. He spoke about these documents carefully, acknowledging he had seen them only briefly and under controlled conditions. He spoke calmly throughout, with apparent technical confidence, without the breathless urgency of someone performing a story. Many who watched the interview, and many more who would watch it in the years that followed, as recordings circulated and the clip found new audiences, noted that he didn't seem like a person who was simply making things up for attention. He seemed, if anything, slightly reluctant. Like someone who had decided, after a period of internal deliberation, that silence was no longer something he was willing to maintain. The story spread, first through the UFO research community, then into mainstream press, then slowly, steadily, into the broader culture. Lazar's claims became the foundation for much of what the general public would come to associate with Area 51 in the years that followed. His background and credentials have been disputed extensively. We'll return to all of that in some detail later tonight, but for now, it's worth simply noting what his appearance meant. The moment Area 51 stopped being a vague rumour at the edge of public awareness and became, for millions of people, a symbol of something much larger. A symbol of what governments might know and choose not to say. Why this place? Why these questions? It's worth pausing for a moment before we get into the theories themselves to ask a fairly simple question. Why Area 51? There are classified military facilities all over the world. There are restricted zones, government research sites, testing ranges, and secure installations spread across dozens of countries. Many of them are larger, some of them are older, some of them are, in purely practical terms, far more important to the day-to-day operations of modern governments. And yet, this particular base, this dry lake bed in the Nevada desert, has attracted more sustained fascination than almost any other location on Earth. Part of the answer is geographic. The American West carries a particular kind of mythology. It is a landscape that, even now, feels only partially mapped. Long stretches of open land, empty highways that run for hours without interruption. Mountain ranges that conceal more than they reveal. There is a lingering sense, inherited from frontier history, that beyond the next ridge or over the next horizon, something unexpected might be waiting. Nevada, in particular, amplifies that feeling. The desert is not just empty, it is isolating. It absorbs sound. It flattens distance. It creates the impression that whatever happens there could remain unseen simply because there is no one around to see it. Part of the answer is historical. The Cold War did not just produce advanced technology. It produced a culture of secrecy that extended into almost every corner of government activity. Information was compartmentalized. Programs were hidden not only from the public, but from other parts of the government itself. And when some of those programs were eventually revealed, through declassification, through investigative reporting, through accident, they often turned out to be stranger than expected. Experimental aircraft that flew higher and faster than anyone thought possible. Surveillance programs that operated on a global scale. Tests and operations that, for years, officially did not exist. When officials were shown to have concealed those things, even for reasons they considered justified, it changed the baseline level of trust. It introduced a quiet, persistent question into public thinking. If they kept those secrets, what else might they be keeping? And part of the answer is psychological. Human beings are drawn to mystery in a way that is difficult to fully explain. We look for patterns. We try to connect isolated observations into coherent stories. When we encounter something we cannot immediately explain, a light moving strangely across the sky, a document that has been partially erased, a place that exists but is not acknowledged, the mind does not simply leave it alone. It returns to it. It turns it over. It fills in the gaps, sometimes carefully, sometimes creatively. Area 51 sits at the intersection of all of this. A real place with real activity observed just often enough to confirm that something is happening, but not often enough to make that something clear. A history that includes genuine secrecy. A landscape that feels, even in daylight, slightly removed from the ordinary world. All of that together created something unusual. Not just a location, but an idea. A story that never fully resolves. A question that once asked tends to stay with you. The famous theories. Theory 1. Extraterrestrial craft are stored and reverse engineered at Area 51. This is the theory most people encounter first. It is, in many ways, the theory that all the others orbit around. The basic claim is this. At some point in the late 1940s or early 1950s, one or more extraterrestrial spacecraft either crashed or otherwise obtained. were brought to a classified facility in the Nevada desert. There, scientists and engineers have spent decades attempting to understand them, replicate them, and extract whatever technological advantage they might offer. It is a simple idea on its surface, but like many simple ideas, it carries a great deal of implication. The origin of this theory is most commonly traced to the summer of 1947, when a rancher named William Mac Brazel reported finding unusual debris scattered across a large section of his property near Roswell, New Mexico. The material, according to early accounts, did not behave like anything he recognized. It was lightweight, but difficult to damage. Some descriptions mention thin, foil-like sheets that would return to their original shape after being bent. Others describe sticks or beams marked with symbols that did not resemble any known language. The debris was collected by personnel from the nearby Roswell Army Airfield, and for a brief moment, the story took a very specific turn. An official press release stated that the military had recovered a flying disc. That phrase did not exist in a vacuum. Reports of unidentified flying objects had been circulating in the months prior, including a widely publicized sighting by pilot Kenneth Arnold earlier that same year. The idea of discs in the sky, fast, silent, unexplained, was already beginning to settle into public awareness. The Roswell announcement seemed, to some, like confirmation, and then it was withdrawn. The explanation changed, first to a weather balloon, then, decades later, to a classified high-altitude surveillance balloon associated with Project Mogul, a program designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests using sensitive acoustic equipment suspended beneath balloon arrays. The revised explanation was detailed. It was supported by documents. It accounted for many of the materials described, but it arrived after the fact. And once an initial explanation is replaced, it tends to leave a trace behind, a small, persistent doubt about which version was closer to the truth. Over time, that doubt expanded into something larger. As the years passed, additional accounts surfaced. Some were second-hand. Some came from individuals who claimed direct involvement. They spoke of debris being transported under heavy guard. They spoke of material analysis conducted in secure laboratories. A smaller number spoke of bodies, non-human, described in ways that would later become familiar through popular culture. These accounts varied in detail. They did not always agree with one another, but they shared a general direction. Something unusual had been recovered, and it had not been fully explained. At the same time, Area 51 was quietly becoming known, first within aviation circles, then more broadly as the center of the United States' most advanced and most secretive aerospace development. It was where experimental aircraft were tested beyond public view. It was where prototypes flew before they were acknowledged, and sometimes long before they were understood by anyone outside a very small group of people. The connection, once made, was difficult to unmake. If an object of unknown origin had been recovered, where would it be taken? If there were materials or technologies that did not correspond to known science, where would they be studied? If there were questions that could not be asked in public, where would they be pursued? For many, the answer resolved itself into a single location: Area 51. By the 1980s, this line of thinking had already taken hold within certain research communities. But it was Bob Lazar's 1989 account that gave it structure and detail. Lazar did not speak in generalities. He described specific rooms, specific objects, specific processes. He claimed that at a facility he called S4, built into the side of a mountain near Groom Lake, he had seen multiple disc-shaped craft stored in individual bays. He described them as intact, not wreckage, as if they had been preserved rather than reconstructed. He focused, in particular, on propulsion. According to Lazar, the craft did not operate using conventional thrust. There were no wings, no visible engines. Instead, he described a system that manipulated gravity itself, generating what he called a gravitational field. that allowed the craft to move without resistance, to accelerate rapidly, and to change direction in ways that would subject a human pilot, under normal conditions, to extreme forces. Central to this description was a material, element 115. At the time of his interview, element 115 had not yet been synthesized. It existed only as a theoretical entry on the periodic table, a placeholder for an element with a specific atomic number that scientists had not yet observed in stable form. Lazar claimed that within the facility, this element was used as a fuel source, enabling the generation of the gravitational effect he described. Years later, in 2003, scientists succeeded in creating an element with that atomic number. It was highly unstable, decaying in fractions of a second. It was eventually named Moscovium. For some, this was a point in Lazar's favor, a detail that appeared, at least superficially, to align with his earlier statements. For others, it underscored the gap between his claims and established physics, since the synthesized element did not exhibit any of the properties he described. The debate around Lazar has continued ever since. But even setting his account aside, the broader theory has persisted. It appears in films, often as background rather than focus, a sealed hangar, a guarded facility, something covered by a tarp that no one is quite allowed to see. It appears in television, sometimes treated as fiction, sometimes as speculation. It appears in books that attempt to document it, and in others that use it as a starting point for something more imaginative. It has also at times appeared at the edges of official discussion. References to unidentified aerial phenomena, statements acknowledging that not everything observed in the sky has been explained, careful language, chosen in a way that neither confirms nor fully dismisses. And that perhaps is part of why the theory endures. It does not require certainty to continue. It exists in the space between what is known and what is not fully explained. It draws from real events, Roswell, classified programs, experimental aircraft, and extends them just slightly beyond their documented boundaries. Not into something entirely disconnected from reality, but into something adjacent to it. A possibility, rather than a conclusion. It has never been officially confirmed. No government agency has stated that extraterrestrial craft are stored at Area 51. No verifiable physical evidence has been presented that can be independently examined and agreed upon across scientific communities. At the same time, it has never been completely resolved in a way that satisfies everyone who has looked into it, and so it remains, not as a settled claim, but as an ongoing idea. A story that continues to be told, adjusted, reconsidered, a theory that, once encountered, tends to linger quietly in the background, waiting for the next piece of information, whatever that might be. Theory 2. The Roswell connection Roswell and Area 51 are not the same story. They begin in different places, under different circumstances, with different sets of people involved. But over time, they have become closely linked, almost inseparable in the popular imagination. So much so that for many, one implies the other. The specific claim is straightforward. Whatever was recovered near Roswell in July of 1947 did not remain in New Mexico. It was moved, studied, transferred between facilities. And eventually, according to this theory, it found a more permanent home at what would later become Area 51. The sequence of events, as described by proponents of this idea, unfolds gradually. The crash itself is said to have occurred sometime in late June or early July of 1947, during a period of intense summer storms in the region. Lightning, high winds. Conditions that, in ordinary circumstances, might explain scattered debris across a wide area of land. A rancher, Mac Brazel, comes across something unusual while surveying his property. He does not immediately report it. When he does, the response is measured, then sudden, then highly controlled. Military personnel from Roswell Army Airfield arrive. The area is secured. Debris is collected. Accounts differ on what that debris looked like, but many descriptions share certain qualities. lightweight materials, metallic surfaces, objects that do not behave as expected when handled. And then, in some versions of the story, there is something more. Not just debris, but biological material. Bodies non-human in appearance. Small in stature, with proportions that differ from typical human anatomy in subtle but consistent ways. These details vary depending on the account. They are not uniform. They are not easily reconciled into a single, stable narrative. But they appear often enough to form a recognizable pattern within the broader story. According to the theory, this material does not remain in Roswell. It is transported first to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, a facility that, at the time, already had the infrastructure for handling sensitive materials and conducting advanced analysis. Wright-Patterson appears frequently in these accounts, sometimes referred to as the initial destination for both debris and any recovered biological entities. From there, the timeline becomes less precise. The Nevada test site that would later include Area 51 was not formally established until the early 1950s. Groom Lake itself was selected in 1955 for the development of the U-2 aircraft. So, according to proponents of the Roswell to Area 51 connection, there is a gap, a period of several years during which whatever was recovered would have been stored and studied elsewhere. Then, as the Nevada facility developed into a hub for highly classified aerospace work, the material is said to have been transferred again, moved to a location that was more remote, more secure, more permanently outside public awareness, Groom Lake, or, in some versions, a sub-facility associated with it, something like the S4 site, later described by Bob Lazar. This is the narrative, in its most commonly told form, but the details within it are far from consistent. The accounts that support this version of events are numerous. They come from different decades, different sources, different levels of claimed proximity to the event itself. Some are first-hand, many are second-hand. Some are based on interviews conducted years later, where memory has had time to shift and settle into something that feels coherent, whether or not it is entirely accurate. Different witnesses describe different numbers of craft. Some say 1, others say 2, or more. Different numbers of recovered bodies. Different conditions of those bodies. Some describe entities that were clearly deceased. Others suggest that at least one may have survived for a short period of time after recovery. There are differences in location as well. Some accounts place all debris at a single site. Others describe multiple sites spread across a wider area. In certain tellings, what was initially discovered was only part of a larger event, a secondary crash, or a separate debris field that was located later. Even the timeline shifts slightly, depending on who is telling the story. And yet, despite these inconsistencies, the core idea persists. Something came down. Something was recovered. And whatever it was, it did not enter the public domain in a clear or transparent way. What makes Roswell particularly interesting, even when set aside from the extraterrestrial interpretation, is that it does not require speculation to establish that something unusual occurred. Debris was found. That much is documented. The Army did issue a press release referring to a flying disc. That is part of the historical record. That statement was then retracted, replaced with a more conventional explanation. And that explanation evolved over time, first described as a weather balloon, then later as part of Project Mogul, a classified program involving high-altitude balloons designed to detect nuclear tests. Each version addresses certain aspects of the event. None fully resolves all of the questions that were raised by the initial announcement and the accounts that followed. And it is within that unresolved space that the connection to Area 51 takes hold. Because if something of unknown origin was recovered, something that did not fit easily into existing categories, then the question becomes not just what it was, but where it went. Where would it be studied? Where would it be stored? Where would it be kept if its existence, for whatever reason, was not meant to be widely known? By the time Area 51 entered public awareness as a site of highly advanced and deeply classified aerospace work, it provided a kind of answer, not a confirmed answer, but a plausible one within the logic of the theory. A remote location, restricted access, a history of secrecy, a place where unusual technology was known, even officially, to be tested and developed. The connection, one suggested, became difficult to separate. Whether or not the Roswell material, whatever it may have been, was ever transported to Groom Lake remains an open question. There is no publicly available documentation that confirms such a transfer. There is no physical evidence that can be examined independently to establish a clear chain of custody from New Mexico to Nevada. At the same time, the idea has become embedded in the broader narrative. It appears alongside the theory of reverse-engineered craft. It supports it. It provides an origin point, a beginning to a story that might otherwise feel incomplete. And like many elements of this larger conversation, it does not resolve cleanly. It remains a possibility. A connection drawn across time and distance. A thread that links one of the most well-known incidents in modern UFO history to one of the most secretive locations in the American desert. A thread that, once noticed, is difficult to entirely let go of. Theory 3. Live extraterrestrial contact and agreements with non-human intelligence. This theory takes the previous ones a step further. Where earlier ideas focus on recovery, debris, craft, materials, this one introduces something more active. Ongoing interaction. Communication, a relationship of some kind between human institutions and non-human intelligence. The claim, in its most widely circulated form, is this: at some point, most accounts place it in the 1950s. Representatives of the United States government entered into a formal agreement with one or more extraterrestrial civilizations. The terms of that agreement vary depending on the source, but the structure tends to remain consistent. In exchange for access to advanced technology, the government agreed to permit a controlled level of extraterrestrial activity on Earth. That activity, in some versions of the story, includes surveillance. In others, it includes limited interaction with human populations. And in its more unsettling forms, it includes biological experimentation, often described as abductions carried out under the terms of the agreement. The tone of the theory shifts here. It moves away from the idea of hidden objects and into the idea of hidden decisions. The person most closely associated with bringing this version of the story into wider public awareness is Milton William Cooper. In 1991, Cooper published a book titled Behold a Pale Horse, a work that blends personal claims, government critique, and a broader narrative about secrecy and control. Cooper, who had a background in naval service and described himself as having had access to intelligence materials, claimed that during his time in service he encountered documents that outlined a deeply classified program. At the center of this program, he said, was a group called Majestic 12. According to Cooper's account, Majestic 12, often abbreviated as MJ-12, was a committee established by President Harry Truman in 1947, shortly after the Roswell incident. Its purpose was to manage all aspects of extraterrestrial contact and recovered technology. It operated outside normal governmental oversight. Its activities were compartmentalized. Its existence, in official terms, was never acknowledged. Within this framework, Area 51, or associated facilities, becomes not just a storage or testing site, but a meeting point. A location where exchange occurs, where technology is studied, and where communication, in some form, is maintained. The Majestic 12 documents themselves have been studied extensively. They began to surface in the 1980s, often anonymously, sent to researchers, journalists, and investigators. The documents appeared official in structure, typewritten memos, classified markings, references to real individuals in government positions at the time. For some, they carried the weight of authenticity. For others, they raised immediate concerns. Over time, document analysts, historians, and forensic experts examined them in detail. The consensus among these experts is that the MJ-12 documents are fabrications, constructed using elements of real historical context, but not genuine artifacts of government record. And yet, the idea they describe did not disappear with that conclusion. In some ways, it became more flexible, freed from the need to rely on a single set of documents, the broader narrative that are small. Secretive group within the government manages contact with non-human intelligence continued to evolve. It appeared in different forms, attached to different names, adapted to different eras of technology and political context. It is a theory that aligns easily with existing concerns about secrecy. Governments do make decisions behind closed doors. Classified programs do exist. Oversight is sometimes limited. Information is sometimes withheld for reasons that are not immediately shared with the public. These are established realities. The theory extends those realities into a more speculative domain. Not just hidden programs, but hidden relationships. Not just advanced technology, but technology that originates elsewhere. And not just secrecy for strategic advantage, but secrecy around something that would fundamentally alter how people understand their place in the world. In more recent years, elements of this idea have appeared, in a more restrained form, in official settings. In 2023, a former intelligence officer named David Grush testified before the United States House of Representatives. In his testimony, Grush stated that he had been informed of programs involving recovered craft of what he described as non-human intelligence. He also stated that he had been denied access to certain programs despite his official role, and that he believed information was being withheld improperly within parts of the government. His testimony did not confirm the existence of agreements. It did not describe direct contact in the way earlier versions of the theory do. It was careful, limited to what he said he could speak about within legal boundaries. But it introduced language, non-human intelligence, recovered craft, denied access, that echoed aspects of the older narratives. And once again, the connection to Area 51 was made, not through direct statement, but through association, a known location of secrecy, a known site of advanced research, a place already embedded in the public imagination as a center for the unknown. Whether or not any formal agreement between human governments and extraterrestrial civilizations exists, and there is no verified evidence that it does, the idea carries a particular weight. It shifts the focus from what has been found to what has been decided. It suggests that the most important events may not be physical discoveries, but quiet negotiations. That the defining moments may not be visible at all, but recorded only in documents that are never released, discussed only in rooms that are never acknowledged. And that possibility, more than the details of any single claim, is what gives the theory its persistence. It speaks to a familiar tension, the sense that systems of power operate at a scale and level of complexity that is difficult to fully observe from the outside. The sense that information moves in layers and that what is visible is only a portion of what exists. In that sense, the theory is not only about extraterrestrial contact, it is about trust, about who knows what, and who decides what is shared, and about the quiet possibility that some of the most significant decisions, whether they involve technology, contact, or something else entirely, may be made without ever becoming part of the public record. It is, like the others, unresolved, and it remains not as a confirmed account, but as a story that continues to be told, considered, and, in certain circles, believed. Theory 4, the moon landing was filmed at Area 51. This theory sits at a slightly different angle from the others. It doesn't necessarily depend on extraterrestrial contact, recovered craft, or unknown materials. Instead, it centers on something more familiar, the possibility of deception carried out on a global scale, at a moment when the world was watching very closely. The claim is this: the Apollo 11 moon landing of July 1969, and in some versions, later Apollo missions as well, was either partially or entirely staged. The images broadcast to millions of people were not captured on the lunar surface, but on Earth, carefully constructed, carefully filmed, and presented as something they were not. The location most often named is Area 51, not because of any confirmed connection, but because of what the place represents: a closed environment, complete control over access, infrastructure capable of supporting large-scale technical projects, and, perhaps most importantly, distance, physical and informational, from public oversight. The theory unfolds in several layers. At its center is the question of capability. In 1969, the technological challenge of landing a human being on the moon and returning them safely to Earth was immense. It required precise calculations, new materials, guidance systems that were still in their early stages of development, and coordination across thousands of engineers and contractors. The margin for error was extremely small. Proponents of the theory argue that the challenge was, in fact, too great, that the timeline, driven by political pressure during the Cold War, did not allow for the level of reliability required, that the risks of failure, especially in a public and highly visible way, were unacceptable, and that, faced with those constraints, the decision was made to simulate success rather than attempt it under uncertain conditions. From there, the focus shifts to the footage itself. Certain details in the Apollo recordings have been examined repeatedly by supporters of the theory. The way shadows fall across the lunar surface, the apparent movement of the American flag, which seems to ripple despite the absence of atmosphere, the brightness of objects in shadow, the absence of visible stars in the sky. Each of these observations has been interpreted as evidence that the scene was constructed under artificial lighting conditions, possibly on a soundstage, where light sources and environmental effects could be controlled. Within this framework, Area 51 becomes a logical setting, a place where such a set could be built without interruption, where access could be limited to those directly involved, where materials, equipment, and personnel could be transported without public visibility, a location that, by its nature, would not appear in any official account. And then there is Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick's film 2001, A Space Odyssey, released in 1968, is often cited as a key reference point. The film depicted space travel with a level of visual realism that was unusual for its time. The motion of objects, the use of silence, the attention to detail in spacecraft design. For many viewers, it created a sense of authenticity that blurred the line between fiction and plausible reality. From this, a narrative emerges, that Kubrick's demonstrated ability to create convincing space imagery brought him to the attention of government officials, that he was approached quietly and asked to apply those techniques to something far more consequential, that the moon landing footage, or some portion of it, was produced under his direction, using methods developed for cinema. There are additional elements that are often included in this version of the story. Claims about Kubrick embedding subtle hints in his later films. Interpretations of scenes in The Shining as coded references to Apollo. A disputed documentary in which a man presented as Kubrick appears to confess involvement in staging the moon landing, a recording whose authenticity has been widely questioned. These details vary in credibility. They are not consistently supported, but they contribute to the overall structure of the theory, adding layers that extend beyond the original claim. At its core, however, the idea remains relatively simple: a historic achievement presented to the world, and the possibility, however remote, that it did not occur in the way it was described. Area 51's role in this theory is less about evidence and more about plausibility within a narrative. It functions as a setting that makes the story feel possible. A real place, already associated with secrecy, where an event of this scale could, in theory, be hidden. If such a production were to take place, it would require isolation. It would require technical infrastructure. It would require the ability to operate without external observation. The desert. the restricted zone, the place with no address. At the same time, even within communities that explore unconventional explanations, this theory occupies a particular position. It does not rest on a single event that remains unexplained. The moon landing, unlike many other topics in this space, has been extensively documented. There are thousands of photographs, hours of footage, independent tracking data, physical samples, lunar rocks, that have been studied by scientists around the world. And yet, the theory persists, not necessarily because it resolves those details, but because it speaks to something broader. The idea that large institutions, under pressure, might construct a narrative rather than risk failure. The idea that technology, especially in its early stages, might not be as reliable as it appears in hindsight. And the idea that what people see, even on a global scale, may not always reflect what actually occurred. In that sense, it aligns with the other theories, even as it diverges in subject. It is less about what is out there, and more about what is presented here, less about the unknown, and more about the possibility of controlled information. Whether or not any part of the Apollo missions was staged, and there is no verified evidence that it was, the association with Area 51 follows a familiar pattern. A real place with real secrecy becomes the backdrop for a story that extends beyond what can be directly confirmed. And once that connection is made, it tends to remain, quietly in the background. Another layer added to a location that already carries more stories than any one place is likely meant to hold. The deep and fringe theories. The underground city this is where things get considerably stranger. Among the more persistent claims about Area 51 is the idea that what is visible on the surface, the runways, the hangars, the administrative buildings, represents only a fraction of what actually exists. The real facility, according to this theory, does not end at ground level. It continues downward, beneath the dry lake bed, into a network of tunnels, chambers, and reinforced structures that extend far below the desert floor. From above, the base appears relatively straightforward. Long runways, rectangular buildings, taxiways etched into the pale surface of Groom Lake. It looks in many ways like an airfield designed for testing aircraft in isolation. But proponents of the underground theory suggest that this visible layer is only the outer shell, a kind of surface interface for something much larger and more complex below. The descriptions vary. Some accounts are restrained. They describe a handful of subterranean levels, secure laboratories, storage areas, perhaps shielded environments for sensitive experiments. This version aligns closely with known military construction practices. Underground facilities offer protection from surveillance, from environmental extremes, and, historically, from the threat of nuclear attack. Other accounts move further. They describe multiple levels, stacked beneath one another, connected by elevators and access shafts. Entire sections dedicated to specific types of research. Separate zones for propulsion systems, materials analysis, and what are sometimes described as biological studies. In these tellings, the underground space is not auxiliary. It is primary. And then there are the more expansive versions. These are the accounts that describe something closer to a subterranean city. A self-contained environment extending downward for hundreds, sometimes thousands, of feet. A place with internal transportation systems. Rail lines or tunnel networks connecting distant sections of the facility. Living quarters for personnel who remain on site for extended periods. Independent power systems, air circulation and filtration systems designed to operate continuously, isolated from the surface. In these versions, the surface base becomes almost incidental, a cover, or perhaps just the visible portion of a much larger structure whose true scale is intentionally concealed. The idea draws some of its strength from real documented history. During the Cold War, the United States, along with other nuclear powers, invested heavily in underground construction. Facilities were designed to survive worst-case scenarios, to remain operational even if the surface world above them was compromised. NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex is often cited as an example, a functioning military installation built deep solid rock, protected by massive blast doors and supported by its own internal infrastructure. There are also lesser-known bunkers, continuity of government sites, storage facilities, research installations. Many of them remain partially classified. Some are acknowledged only in outline. So the concept of building underground is not speculative. It is established practice. What changes in the case of Area 51 is the proposed scale and the purpose. Because if the facility below the surface is as extensive as some accounts suggest, then it is not simply about protection. It is about concealment on a different level. Not just shielding from external threats, but from observation itself. Support for the underground city theory is often drawn from indirect sources. Satellite imagery, for example, has been studied closely. Analysts look for patterns, disturbed earth, unusual construction activity, ventilation shafts, heat signatures that might indicate subsurface operations. Some point to the gradual expansion of surface infrastructure as evidence that something below is also growing. Seismic data is sometimes referenced as well. The idea being that large underground spaces, particularly those with ongoing activity, might produce detectable anomalies, vibrations, structural signatures that differ from the surrounding geology. These interpretations are debated. The data is complex, and nothing that has been publicly presented has provided a clear, widely accepted confirmation of a massive subterranean structure beneath Groom Lake. But absence of confirmation, in this context, does not resolve the question. It simply leaves space for interpretation. And the theory persists, in part, because it answers something that the surface facility does not fully explain. If what is happening at Area 51 is limited to aircraft testing, even highly advanced aircraft, then the visible infrastructure appears sufficient. Large runways, secure hangars, remote location. These elements already provide a high level of operational secrecy. So why the additional layers? Why the intensity of restriction? Why the long history of non-acknowledgement? Why the sense, reported by those who have observed the perimeter, that the boundary itself is treated with unusual seriousness? The underground city theory offers a simple answer. Because most of what matters is not visible. Because the primary work is not happening in the open air, but below it, out of sight, out of reach, in a space that cannot be observed from satellites or aircraft or distant hills. It reframes the entire location, not as an airfield, but as an entrance. A surface marker for something that extends downward into the earth, carrying with it whatever work, research, or activity has been placed there. Whether that structure exists at the scale described is an open question. There is no publicly verified evidence confirming a vast underground city beneath Area 51. At the same time, the idea fits neatly within the broader pattern that surrounds the base, partial visibility, limited information, and a long history of secrecy. And so, it remains. A theory that shifts the focus from what can be seen to what cannot. A suggestion that the most important parts of the story may not be above the ground at all, but somewhere beneath it, quiet, contained, and largely inaccessible. Hidden not just by distance, but by depth. The alien biology and genetic experimentation claims some accounts of Area 51 move away from spacecraft and into biology. They shift the focus from machines to bodies, from propulsion systems and materials to something more intimate, and, for many people, more unsettling. The claim, in its most basic form, is that at some point, most versions place it in the 1950s or 60s. Biological material of non-human origin was recovered and brought to a classified facility. At first, this material was studied in a way that would be familiar to any scientific discipline. It was observed, catalogued, preserved, examined for structure and composition. But over time, according to these accounts, the research did not remain passive. It became active. The descriptions vary depending on the source, but they tend to follow a similar progression. Initial analysis leads to deeper investigation. Questions about anatomy lead to questions about function. How does this organism sustain itself? How does it process energy? How does it heal? How does it reproduce? If it reproduces at all. From there, the theory expands. Some accounts describe attempts to replicate specific biological properties, resilience to radiation, resistance to disease, or neurological structures that differ from those found in humans. Others suggest efforts to synthesize or adapt these properties for human use, framed as research into medicine or survival in extreme environments. And then there are the more extreme versions. These describe programs aimed not just at understanding non-human biology, but at combining it with human genetics. Hybridization, the creation of organisms that exist somewhere between categories, not fully human, not fully something else. In these tellings, Area 51 is not just a research site. It is a controlled environment for experimentation at the boundary of what biology allows. It should be said clearly, and without ambiguity, that there is no verified evidence supporting these claims. Modern genetics is a highly developed field. The human genome has been mapped, sequenced, compared across populations and across species. If non-human genetic material had been integrated into the human gene pool in any systematic way, it would be detectable. It would appear as an anomaly, a sequence that does not align with known evolutionary patterns. No such evidence has been found. No credible scientific institution has published peer-reviewed research based on non-human biological samples. No verified laboratory has produced results that would support the existence of extraterrestrial genetic material, either in isolation or in combination with human DNA. And yet, the theory persists. It often appears alongside reports of abduction, accounts from individuals who describe being taken, examined, and returned. These reports are deeply personal. They vary widely in detail and interpretation. Some describe medical procedures, others describe communication. Many include gaps in memory or experiences that are difficult to place within ordinary frameworks. The connection between these accounts and Area 51 is rarely direct. Instead, it is inferred. If such events were occurring, the reasoning goes, there would need to be a place where information about them is collected, analyzed, and stored. A place where biological data, if it exists, would be studied. And once again, the same location emerges. A remote facility, restricted access, a long-standing association with secrecy. Area 51 becomes, in this context, less a confirmed site and more a focal point, a place where multiple threads of speculation converge. What makes this theory particularly enduring is not its evidentiary basis, but its emotional resonance. It touches on questions that are already present in human thought. What is the body? How much of it do we understand? How much control do institutions have over biological knowledge? What happens when that knowledge is not shared? There is also a long-standing cultural memory of experimentation carried out without consent. Historical examples exist, documented, acknowledged, in which individuals or groups were subjected to medical research without their full understanding or approval. These events, while unrelated to extraterrestrial claims, contribute to a broader sense that such things, under certain conditions, are possible. The theory extends that concern into a more speculative space. Not just hidden research, but hidden biology. Not just undisclosed experiments, but experiments involving forms of life that are not publicly recognized. It introduces a deeper uncertainty, not only about what might be happening in a distant, restricted location, but about the boundaries of what it means to be human, whether those boundaries are fixed, whether they are fully understood, whether they could, in theory, be altered, whether or not any such program exists, and again, there is no verified evidence that it does, the idea remains. It circulates quietly, sometimes in connection with other theories, sometimes on its own. A narrative that moves away from distant objects in the sky and into something closer, more immediate, more personal. The possibility that the unknown is not just out there, but here. Not just observed, but studied. Not just studied, but, in some accounts, changed, and like the others, it does not resolve. It remains open, unconfirmed, difficult to prove, and equally difficult for some to entirely dismiss. A story that lingers, not because it is established, but because it touches something deeper than evidence alone. A question not just about what might exist, but about what might be done with it, if it did. Element 115 and the propulsion system, we touched on this briefly earlier, in the context of Bob Lazar's claims. But it deserves its own quiet examination, because this part of the story sits at an unusual intersection between physics, speculation, and a kind of technical imagination that feels, at times, almost within reach. Lazar described the propulsion system of the craft he claimed to have worked on as a gravity wave drive, not an engine in the conventional sense, not something that burns fuel and pushes against air or vacuum, instead, a system that interacts with gravity itself. According to his description, the craft did not move through space in the way aircraft or rockets do. It altered the space around it. He suggested that the system generated a distortion, a kind of localized gravitational field. That allowed the craft to effectively fall in a chosen direction. Rather than accelerating through space, it would bring its destination closer, compressing distance in front of it and expanding it behind. It is a concept that, in a very loose sense, echoes certain theoretical ideas in physics. General relativity describes gravity not as a force in the traditional sense, but as a curvature of spacetime caused by mass and energy. Objects follow the curves created by that distortion. Under extreme conditions, those distortions can become significant, near stars, near black holes, at scales far beyond anything encountered in everyday experience. There are speculative models, often discussed in theoretical physics, that imagine propulsion systems based on similar principles. Concepts like the Alcubierre drive, proposed in the 1990s, describe a method of faster than light travel by contracting space in front of a vessel and expanding it behind. These ideas remain theoretical. They require conditions and forms of energy that have not been demonstrated to be achievable. Lazar's description exists somewhere adjacent to these ideas, not identical, not derived from them in any formal way, but similar enough in structure to feel, to some listeners, like a version of something that physics has at least considered in abstract terms. At the center of his account is element 115, at the time of his interview in 1989. This element did not exist in any laboratory. The periodic table extended to known elements with lower atomic numbers, and while scientists anticipated that heavier elements might be synthesized in the future, their properties were unknown. Lazar claimed not only that element 115 existed, but that it possessed very specific characteristics. According to him, it could be used to generate a stable energy source. When bombarded with protons, it would produce antimatter, which, when combined with normal matter, would release large amounts of energy. This energy, in turn, would power the gravitational system of the craft. It was, in his telling, both fuel and mechanism, a key that made the entire system possible. Years later, in 2003, scientists at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Dubna succeeded in synthesizing an element with that atomic number. The process was complex. It involved accelerating ions and colliding them with target atoms, producing a new element for a fraction of a second before it decayed. Subsequent experiments in Germany and the United States confirmed the result. In 2016, the element was officially recognized and named moscovium. On the surface, this appears to align with part of Lazar's claim. He referenced an element by number. That element was later created. But the alignment becomes less clear when looking at the details. The synthesized element is highly unstable. It exists only for extremely short periods before decaying into lighter elements. Its properties, as observed, do not include the generation of antimatter under the conditions described. It does not exhibit any known interaction with gravity beyond what would be expected from its mass. In other words, the element exists. But it does not behave, as far as current science can determine, in the way Lazar described. This leaves the story in a particular kind of balance. Supporters suggest that the version of element 115 available in a laboratory is not the same as the one described. That a stable isotope, one not yet synthesized, or perhaps not possible to synthesize with current methods, could exist with different properties. That what scientists have created is only a brief, unstable glimpse of something that, under different conditions, might behave differently. Critics point out that these distinctions are speculative, that there is no experimental evidence supporting the existence of a stable isotope with the properties described, that the gap between known nuclear physics and the claims made is significant, and that referencing an element by atomic number, while specific, does not in itself validate the broader system built around it. And so, the idea settles into a familiar space, not fully aligned with established science, not entirely disconnected from it either. A concept that borrows the language of physics, gravity, antimatter, atomic structure, and extends it beyond what has been demonstrated into a domain that remains theoretical, or perhaps entirely imagined. What gives it staying power is not just the element itself, but the picture it helps create. A propulsion system that does not rely on combustion. A craft that moves without visible effort. A technology that appears to bypass the limitations that define current engineering. Whether or not such a system exists, the idea has a certain internal coherence. It fits within a broader pattern of thought that advanced civilizations, if they exist, might develop technologies that operate on principles we only partially understand. That what seems impossible at one stage of knowledge may, at another, become routine. At the same time, it remains unverified. No working example has been presented, no experimental data supports the specific mechanisms described, and so it continues to exist in that quiet, uncertain space. Part science, part speculation. A detail that feels precise enough to hold on to, and open-ended enough to be interpreted in different ways. And in that space, as with so many elements of this story, it remains. The time travel and teleportation claims some theories about Area 51 have moved over the years into territory that even many UFO researchers consider too speculative to engage with seriously. They step beyond hidden aircraft, beyond recovered materials, even beyond extraterrestrial contact, into something more expansive and more difficult to anchor to any shared understanding of reality. Among these are claims that the facility has been used or is currently being used for research into time travel and teleportation. The most well-known version of this story centers on a project sometimes referred to as Project Pegasus. According to accounts given by Andrew Basiago, this program operated in the late 1960s and early 1970s under the direction of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Basiago claims that, as a child, he was recruited to participate in experiments involving teleportation and a system he described as chronovision. The description is detailed. Teleportation, in this context, is presented not as a gradual movement from one place to another, but as an instantaneous transition. A person enters a device, often described as a chamber or a portal, and emerges somewhere else entirely, without traversing the space in between. In some tellings, this is achieved through the manipulation of electromagnetic fields. In others, through more abstract interactions with space-time itself. Chronovision, as described in these accounts, is something different. Not movement, but observation. A technology that allows the viewer to see events at different points in time, past or future. as if they were watching a distant location through a window. Basiago has described witnessing historical events through this system. He has also claimed that the program extended beyond observation into actual physical travel across time. In one of the more widely circulated elements of his story, he describes being teleported to Mars. The details vary slightly depending on the version of the account, but the core idea remains the same, that advanced technologies existed within classified programs capable of moving individuals not only across space, but across time. There is no documentary evidence supporting the existence of Project Pegasus. DARPA has never acknowledged such a program. No records, technical papers, or corroborated testimonies have emerged that would place these activities within any verifiable institutional framework. Scientists working in fields related to these claims, quantum mechanics, relativity, space-time geometry, consistently note that the mechanisms described do not align with established physical theory. Teleportation, in a limited sense, does exist within modern science. Quantum teleportation allows for the transfer of information between particles under specific conditions. But this process does not move matter. It does not transport objects, let alone human beings. It operates at a scale and in a manner very different from the scenarios described in these accounts. Time travel, as understood in physics, is even more constrained. General relativity allows for certain theoretical constructs, solutions to equations that permit closed time-like curves, or extreme distortions of spacetime. But these conditions require energies and configurations that are not known to be achievable. They remain mathematical possibilities, not engineered realities. And yet, the story continues. It appears in interviews, in conferences, in online archives and recorded talks. It evolves slightly over time, but retains its core structure. Alongside it, a somewhat more grounded variation persists, one that draws on the legacy of Nikola Tesla. Tesla's work in the early 20th century was, in many respects, ahead of its time. His research into electrical systems, wireless transmission, and electromagnetic fields contributed to technologies that are now commonplace. After his death in 1943, some of his papers were collected by government authorities, leading to speculation that certain ideas may have been classified or left unexplored in the public domain. From this, a narrative develops that Tesla's unpublished work contained insights into energy and field manipulation that could, if extended, influence the structure of spacetime itself. That classified research programs, possibly including those associated with Area 51, built upon these ideas. And that, somewhere within that lineage, technologies emerged that approach what we would describe as teleportation, or temporal observation. This version of the theory is more technically framed. It uses the language of fields, resonance, frequency, and energy. It attempts to position itself closer to known science, even as it extends beyond it. But like the others, it remains unverified. No experimental results, no reproducible demonstrations, no confirmed applications. What makes these theories persist is not their alignment with current knowledge, but the space they occupy in imagination. They represent a kind of technological horizon. The idea that the limits we experience, distance, duration, sequence, may not be absolute. That under different conditions, or with different tools, those limits could be altered, shortened, bypassed entirely. And more specifically, they suggest that such tools may already exist. Not in the future, but now. Hidden, developed quietly, in places that are not accessible, under programs that are not publicly described, known to a small number of people, and withheld from everyone else. It is a powerful idea, not because it is supported, but because it reverses the usual direction of progress. Instead of imagining that these technologies will one day be discovered, it proposes that they already have been, and that what we experience as limitation is not a boundary of nature, but a boundary of access. Area 51, in this context, becomes less a place and more a container for possibility. a location where the most advanced ideas can be placed without needing to be demonstrated, a setting where the distance between what is known and what is imagined can be quietly closed. Whether or not any such research has ever taken place, and there is no credible evidence that it has, the theory continues to circulate, not as a settled claim, but as an extension, a step beyond even the other stories, into a space where the rules themselves begin to shift, and where, for some, the question is no longer just what is hidden, but how far that hidden knowledge might go. The Men in Black Connection No survey of Area 51 conspiracy would be complete without at least passing through the shadow of the Men in Black. They occupy a different kind of space in this landscape, less technical, less concerned with machinery or materials, more personal, more immediate. Not about what is hidden in a distant facility, but about what happens when someone gets too close to asking the wrong question. The phenomenon, if it can be called that, has been reported since at least the 1950s. The accounts tend to follow a pattern. An individual witnesses something unusual, a light in the sky, an object behaving in ways that do not align with known aircraft. Or they begin researching the subject, collecting reports, conducting interviews, publishing findings, and then, shortly afterward, they receive a visit. The visitors arrive without much warning. They are described as wearing dark suits, black jackets, black ties, white shirts. Their clothing is often noted as slightly outdated, or just slightly off, as if assembled from an approximation of what formal attire is supposed to look like, rather than drawn from current fashion. They are usually said to travel in black vehicles, sometimes described as large sedans, without identifying markings. They identify themselves, in most accounts, as government agents. But the identification is often vague. No clear agency, no verifiable credentials, just enough authority implied to make the interaction difficult to dismiss. The message they deliver is consistent. Stop asking questions. Sometimes it is stated directly. Sometimes it is implied through tone, through presence, through the careful suggestion that continuing along a certain line of inquiry would be unwise. Witnesses often describe the encounters as unsettling in ways that go beyond the words exchanged. There is a quality in many of these accounts that is difficult to define. The individuals are described as human, but not entirely. Their movements may be slightly too precise, or slightly delayed. Their speech sometimes described as formal, or oddly structured, as if following a script that does not quite match natural conversation. In some reports, they appear unfamiliar with ordinary objects or behaviors, eating, drinking, or interacting with their surroundings in ways that feel rehearsed. These details are not consistent across all accounts. Some describe entirely ordinary individuals, serious, direct, but unmistakably human. Others emphasize the strangeness, the sense that something about the interaction does not align with expectation, and that ambiguity becomes part of the phenomenon itself. The connection to Area 51 is not usually direct. The Men in Black do not typically reference the facility by name. They do not, in most accounts, explain what they are protecting or why. The link is inferred. If there is something at Area 51 worth keeping hidden, something significant enough to justify decades of secrecy, then it follows, within the logic of these stories, that there would be a mechanism for managing information outside the facility, a way to contain curiosity, a way to discourage investigation before it reaches a point where it becomes difficult to control. The Men in Black, in this framework, serve that role. They are not the secret itself. They are the response to it. A visible edge of an otherwise invisible system. Whether that system is governmental, something else, or entirely constructed through narrative is less clear. There are several ways these accounts are interpreted. One view is that they represent actual government agents, operating in an unofficial capacity, tasked with discouraging public discussion of sensitive topics. This interpretation places the phenomenon within known structures: intelligence agencies, classified programs, information control. Another view suggests something less conventional, that the individuals described are not entirely human, that they represent some other form of intelligence, possibly connected to the very phenomena they appear to be managing. In this version, the men in black are not simply enforcers, but participants. And then there is a third possibility, that the phenomenon is, at least in part, a cultural construction, a pattern that is developed over time, shaped by repeated storytelling, shared expectations, and the natural tendency for narratives to reinforce themselves. Once the idea exists, once it becomes known that people who report unusual sightings might also report unusual visits, it becomes easier for new accounts to follow the same structure. Not necessarily as fabrication, but as interpretation. An experience filtered through an existing framework. What is notable is that these accounts existed long before they entered popular culture in a lighter form. Before films, before cartoons. Before the image of the men in black became something stylized or humorous. The earlier reports were not presented that way. They were described as tense, unsettling, sometimes frightening. Encounters that left a lasting impression, not because of what was proven, but because of how they felt. And that tone remains, even as the imagery has been adapted and softened in other contexts. Within the broader Area 51 narrative, the men in black occupy a particular role. They do not explain anything, they do not provide evidence, they do not resolve the questions. Instead, they reinforce the idea that the questions themselves may be unwelcome, that there are boundaries, not just physical, marked by fences and warning signs, but informational. Lines that, once crossed, are met not with answers, but with presence. A quiet knock, a brief conversation, and a suggestion, delivered calmly, that some subjects are better left alone. Whether those encounters reflect something external or something internal, a response shaped by expectation, fear, or narrative, they remain part of the story, not at its center, but at its edges, where curiosity meets resistance, and where the act of asking questions becomes, in itself, part of what is being observed. Interdimensional beings and the non-extraterrestrial hypothesis, this is perhaps the strangest turn the theories take, and in some respects the most philosophically interesting. It asks the listener to shift perspective, not just to consider unfamiliar technology or distant worlds, but to reconsider the basic assumption underlying many of the earlier theories, that whatever is being encountered comes from somewhere else in the same physical universe. A minority position within the broader UFO research community, but one articulated by some of its more methodical and analytically inclined figures, suggests something different, that the entities associated with these encounters are not extraterrestrial in the conventional sense. They are not travelers moving from one star system to another, crossing vast distances of space in advanced vehicles. They are not bound in that way by the same constraints of distance and time that define our understanding of interstellar travel. Instead, according to this view, they originate from somewhere else entirely. A different dimension, a different layer of reality, a domain that exists alongside our own, but is not normally accessible to it. In this framework, encounters are not arrivals. They are intersections, moments where two layers of reality overlap, briefly, allowing something to pass through, or at least to be perceived. The objects seen in the sky, the figures described in close encounters, the sense, often reported, that the experience does not behave according to familiar physical rules. All of these, proponents suggest, are better explained not as visitors from far away, but as intrusions from very near, just beyond the range of ordinary perception. Jacques Val is one of the central figures associated with this line of thinking. A computer scientist by training, Val approached the subject with a different set of assumptions than many of his contemporaries. In the 1960s and 70s, he began to notice patterns in reported encounters that did not fit comfortably within the extraterrestrial hypothesis. The behavior described in these encounters often appeared inconsistent. Objects that moved in ways that suggested physical craft and then disappeared abruptly, without transition. Entities that seemed aware of the observer in ways that felt intentional, almost staged. Experiences that blended physical sensation with elements more commonly associated with dreams or altered states of consciousness. Vale proposed that these patterns pointed towards something else. Not a single, unified phenomenon, but a system of interactions that might involve consciousness as much as physical presence. A kind of interface, where perception, expectation, and external stimulus combine in ways that are not yet fully understood. In his view, the phenomenon behaved less like a visitation and more like a control system. Not necessarily in the sense of deliberate manipulation, but in the sense of something that interacts with human awareness in structured, repeatable ways, shaping experiences, adapting to cultural context, appearing differently across time while retaining certain underlying features. This interpretation moves the conversation into unfamiliar territory, away from engineering and toward perception, away from distance and toward proximity. Because if the source of these encounters is not distant, but adjacent, not across space, but across some other boundary, then the nature of the interaction changes. The craft in that case may not be vehicles in the traditional sense. They may be representations, interfaces, temporary forms that allow something non-physical, or not fully physical, to become visible within our frame of reference. The entities, similarly, may not be biological organisms as we understand them. They may be expressions, shaped in ways that the human mind can process, but not necessarily reflective of their underlying nature. The connection to Area 51 within this framework becomes more abstract. If what is being studied there, if anything is being studied there, involves phenomena that do not behave according to conventional physics, then the challenge is not just technical. It is conceptual. How do you research something that does not remain stable? How do you measure something that may depend on observation to exist in a particular form? How do you explain findings that do not fit within existing scientific language? The secrecy, in that context, becomes easier to understand, not only because of potential technological implications, but because of the difficulty of communication, because even a clear description might not be easily received, or might be misunderstood in ways that create more confusion than clarity. This theory does not provide concrete answers. It does not offer specific mechanisms that can be tested or demonstrated. Instead, it reframes the question. Not what are they, in terms of origin and structure, but how do they appear, and why in that way? It suggests that the phenomenon may be less like an object to be discovered, and more like a process to be experienced. Something that interacts. Something that adapts. Something that exists at the edge of what can be clearly described. And that is part of what gives the idea its quiet persistence. It does not demand belief. It does not insist. It simply offers a different way of looking at the same set of observations, one that shifts the focus from outer space to something closer, and perhaps more difficult to define. A nearby unknown rather than a distant one. A boundary not of distance, but of understanding. And a possibility that, if taken seriously, changes not just the question of what might be hidden at Area 51, but the nature of reality itself, or at least the small portion of it that we are currently able to perceive. The counterpoint layer. What the government has actually said, of course, not everyone finds these theories convincing, and it's worth spending some time with what is actually known and acknowledged about Area 51 before we go any further into the open questions. For decades, the official position of the United States government was simple. It did not discuss the base, not in detail, not in passing, not even to confirm that it existed. This absence of acknowledgement was not unusual in itself. Governments routinely classify sensitive facilities, but what made Area 51 distinct was the duration and consistency of that silence, even as public awareness of the location steadily increased. That changed, at least in part, in 2013. In response to a Freedom of Information Act request, the CIA declassified a collection of documents relating to the development of the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. These documents included references to the Nevada test site and, more specifically, to Groom Lake, identifying it as the location where the U-2 program had been developed and tested beginning in the mid-1950s. For the first time, the existence of Area 51 was officially acknowledged. The documents described the selection of Groom Lake as a test site. It was remote, difficult to access, surrounded by terrain that limited visibility from the outside. The dry lake bed provided a natural runway, flat, expansive, and capable of supporting aircraft operations without the need for extensive initial construction. The U-2 program itself was outlined in detail. Developed during a period of intense geopolitical tension, the aircraft was designed to fly at altitudes beyond the reach of existing Soviet air defenses. Its purpose was surveillance, to gather photographic intelligence on missile installations, military bases, and industrial sites deep within Soviet territory. At the time of its development, nothing like it had been publicly acknowledged. Its flight characteristics were unusual. Its altitude extreme. Pilots described the experience as operating at the edge of what the aircraft and the human body could tolerate. From the ground, under certain conditions, the aircraft could appear as a bright point of light moving across the sky at high speed, sometimes at altitudes where commercial or military aircraft were not expected to be. This, the documents suggest, contributed to a wave of unidentified flying object reports during the late 1950s. Observers were seeing something real, but they had no framework for identifying it. The same pattern continued with later aircraft. The A-12 Oxcart, developed in the 1960s, pushed speed and altitude even further. It would later evolve into the SR-71 Blackbird, an aircraft capable of sustained flight at speeds exceeding 3 times the speed of sound. The F-117 stealth fighter introduced another layer. Its shape was unlike anything that had flown before. Angular, faceted, designed to reduce radar visibility rather than aerodynamic smoothness. To an observer unfamiliar with its purpose, it did not resemble a conventional aircraft. It looked, in certain lighting conditions, like something else entirely. In this context, many of the reported sightings begin to align with documented activity. Unusual shapes, unusual flight patterns, unusual altitudes, all of them consistent with aircraft that were, at the time, decades ahead of what the public knew existed. The question of secrecy is also addressed, indirectly but clearly. The programs conducted at Area 51 were among the most sensitive in American military and intelligence history. Their success depended not only on engineering, but on concealment. If adversaries understood the capabilities of these aircraft, their altitude, their speed, their detection profile, they could develop countermeasures. Secrecy was not optional, it was part of the design. Admitting that the facility existed would have led, inevitably, to questions about what was happening there. Questions that could not be answered without revealing information considered strategically critical, so the facility remained unacknowledged, even as it became, paradoxically, widely known. This explanation accounts for much of what has been observed: the lights in the sky, the lack of information, the careful avoidance of confirmation. It presents a picture of Area 51 not as a place of unknown phenomena, but as a site of very real, very advanced, and very secret technological development. And for many, this is sufficient. It resolves the mystery without extending beyond what can be supported by documentation. It explains the pattern of sightings without requiring assumptions about extraterrestrial craft or interdimensional entities. It grounds the story in known historical processes, military research, Cold War competition, and the gradual declassification of once hidden programs. At the same time, it does not answer every question. It explains what has been acknowledged. It does not necessarily address what has not, because even within the declassified material, there are limits. Sections remain redacted, programs are referenced only briefly, timelines are outlined but not always in full, and the facility itself, while now officially recognized, continues to operate with a level of secrecy that is consistent with its original purpose. So the official account provides a framework, a stable foundation, a way of understanding how Area 51 came to be and what it has been used for in documented history. For some, that is the end of the story. For others, it is the beginning of a different question. Not whether the government has ever kept secrets, that is already established, but whether everything that matters has now been included in what it has chosen to reveal. And that question, like many others in this landscape, remains open. The skeptical case against the major theories, the skeptical case against the extraterrestrial theories at Area 51, rests on several converging arguments. These arguments do not attempt to explain every reported sighting or every personal account. Instead, they focus on patterns, what would be expected to exist if the claims were true, and what has, so far, not been observed. The first concerns secrecy at scale. If extraterrestrial craft and non-human biological material have been held at Area 51 for more than 70 years, then a significant number of people would, at some point, have interacted with those materials. Engineers, security personnel, administrators, contractors, even within highly compartmentalized programs, the number of individuals involved would likely extend into the hundreds, if not thousands, over that length of time. Skeptics ask a simple question: where is the evidence? Not testimony alone, but documentation. Photographs, verifiable physical samples. Internal records that can be authenticated independently. In other areas of classified history, such materials have eventually surfaced, sometimes decades later, sometimes through declassification, sometimes through unauthorized disclosure. In this case, that has not happened in a way that meets standard evidentiary thresholds. Bob Lazar, for example, produced no documentary evidence to support his claims, no materials that could be examined independently, no records that could be verified outside of his own account. Other individuals who have made similar claims have followed a similar pattern: detailed narratives, but limited or absent corroboration. This absence does not, by itself, prove that the claims are false. There are plausible reasons why evidence might be difficult to obtain. Security measures at highly classified facilities are designed to prevent exactly this kind of disclosure. Legal consequences for violating secrecy agreements can be severe, and in some cases, individuals may simply not have access to materials that could be removed or documented. But over a period of more than 7 decades, the continued absence of verifiable evidence becomes, in itself, a point of consideration. The second argument concerns the nature of the alleged technology. If the United States government has had access to functioning extraterrestrial propulsion systems since the mid-20th century, one might expect that access to have produced observable effects over time. Not necessarily immediate replication, but gradual influence, traces of new principles appearing in aerospace design, incremental breakthroughs that reflect a deeper underlying shift. Instead, the progression of aerospace technology has followed a more continuous path. Aircraft have become faster, more efficient, less detectable, materials have improved, control systems have advanced. But the fundamental principles, lift, thrust, drag, propulsion through combustion or jet dynamics, remain consistent with known physics. Even the most advanced platforms, stealth aircraft, hypersonic prototypes, experimental drones, appear to be extensions of established engineering rather than departures from it. Skeptics argue that if radically different technology were available, it would likely leave some imprint, some indication that a new paradigm had been introduced. Proponents offer a counterpoint. That reverse engineering an unfamiliar technology, especially one originating from a fundamentally different scientific framework, could take far longer than expected. That understanding how something works is not the same as being able to reproduce it. That the gap between observation and application might span generations. This is a reasonable argument. But it also shifts the claim. From this technology exists, and is in use to this technology exists, but remains largely inaccessible. It moves the theory further from observable impact and deeper into a space that is harder to evaluate. The third argument centers on Bob Lazar specifically. Lazar remains one of the most detailed and widely known sources for claims about extraterrestrial technology at Area 51 or associated facilities. His account is specific, technical, consistent over time in many respects, but investigations into his background have raised questions. His claimed educational history, including degrees from MIT and Caltech, has not been verified by those institutions. Records of his attendance have not been found. His employment history during the period in question includes gaps and inconsistencies. Some aspects of his past, when examined independently, do not align with the level of expertise he describes. Lazar has addressed these discrepancies. He has stated that his records were altered or removed as part of an effort to discredit him after he went public with his claims. Within the logic of his account, this explanation is consistent. If a program of that sensitivity existed, it might take steps to protect itself. At the same time, skeptics note that this explanation is difficult to test. It accounts for the absence of evidence, but in a way that cannot be independently confirmed. It introduces a self-sealing structure. The lack of records becomes part of the proof rather than a challenge to it. This pattern appears in other areas of the broader narrative as well. Evidence is absent because it has been hidden. Records are missing because they have been removed. Verification is impossible because access is restricted. These explanations are not inherently illogical, but they do make the claims resistant to standard methods of evaluation. And that, for skeptics, is a central issue. Because without verifiable evidence, without reproducible data, without independent confirmation, the discussion remains in a different category. Not science in the conventional sense, and not history as it is typically documented, but something closer to narrative. A collection of accounts, some detailed, some compelling, but not, at least so far, substantiated in a way that resolves the question. And so the skeptical position does not necessarily claim to have all the answers. It simply points to what is missing, and suggests that, in the absence of that missing information, the more conventional explanations, advanced but human-made technology, misidentified observations, and the natural evolution of stories over time remain the more grounded interpretation. Where the research community disagrees with itself, it's worth noting that the UFO and conspiracy research community is not monolithic. It does not move in a single direction. It does not arrive collectively at a shared conclusion. Instead, it fragments. Researchers who take the extraterrestrial hypothesis seriously often disagree, sometimes quietly, sometimes quite strongly, about almost every specific claim associated with Area 51 and the broader phenomenon. Even at the level of foundational events, there is no consensus. Some believe the Roswell debris was extraterrestrial in origin, a crashed craft, or fragments of one. Others argue that while something unusual was recovered, it may not have been extraterrestrial at all. They suggest alternative explanations that remain unconventional, but more closely tied to experimental terrestrial technology. The same division appears around individuals. Bob Lazar, for example, is accepted by some as a credible whistleblower, someone who provided a rare, detailed glimpse into a hidden program. Others, including researchers who have spent decades investigating UFO phenomena, view his account with skepticism. They point to inconsistencies in his background, gaps in his documentation, and elements of his story that do not align with known science. These disagreements are not minor. They shape the direction of research, they determine which leads are followed and which are set aside, They influence how new information is interpreted, whether it is seen as supporting an existing framework or contradicting it. The question of location introduces another layer of division. Area 51 is often treated in public imagination as the central hub of all related activity. But within the research community, that assumption is not universally accepted. Some believe that whatever significant work may have occurred there in the past has since been relocated, moved to other facilities, deeper underground, or into locations that have not yet entered public awareness. This view suggests a kind of evolution. As awareness of Area 51 increased through media coverage, satellite imagery, and public discussion, the incentive to continue using it as a primary site for highly sensitive research may have diminished. In this framework, the base becomes part of the story's early chapters rather than its current center. Others disagree. They argue that the existing infrastructure, combined with the site's history and established security, makes it unlikely that all activity would be relocated. That even if additional facilities exist elsewhere, Area 51 would remain part of the network, still active, still relevant. There is also disagreement about the role of government itself. Some researchers believe that government agencies possess detailed knowledge about the phenomenon, that they understand far more than they have disclosed, and that information is being actively managed. In this view, secrecy is deliberate and controlled, with clear boundaries around what is shared and what is withheld. Others take a different position. They suggest that while governments have investigated the phenomenon, they may not fully understand it, that the objects observed, the encounters reported, and the data collected do not resolve into a coherent explanation, that agencies tasked with studying these events may be working with incomplete information, uncertain conclusions, and, at times, internal disagreement. In this version of the story, secrecy still exists, but it is not necessarily a cover for complete understanding. It may, instead, reflect uncertainty, a reluctance to present conclusions that are not yet stable, or a recognition that the phenomenon does not fit neatly into existing categories of knowledge. These internal divisions matter, because they indicate something important about the state of the question itself. If a group of researchers, many of whom have spent years or decades examining the same body of reports, documents, and testimony, cannot arrive at consistent conclusions, it suggests that the available information does not point clearly in a single direction. It suggests that the signal, whatever it is, remains difficult to isolate from the surrounding noise. Different interpretations emerge from the same data, different frameworks are applied to the same events, and each framework produces a different version of the story. For an outside observer, this can appear as inconsistency, as a lack of agreement that undermines the credibility of the entire field. But it can also be read another way, as a reflection of genuine uncertainty, a sign that the phenomenon, whether it is technological, psychological, cultural, or something else entirely, has not yet been resolved into a form that allows for clear, shared understanding. In that sense, the disagreement is not just a weakness, it is also a kind of boundary, an indication of where current knowledge ends, and where interpretation begins. Even among those most committed to finding answers, the picture remains incomplete, not settled, not closed, but open, in multiple directions at once. And that openness, more than any single claim, may be the most accurate description of where things stand. What were the lights people actually saw? For decades before Area 51 became publicly known, residents of rural Nevada reported seeing unusual lights in the sky above the test range. They were not always dramatic. Often they were just points of light, small, distant, easy to miss unless you were already looking up. But what made them notable was not their brightness. It was their behavior. They moved differently. Witnesses described lights that crossed the sky in straight, steady paths, and then, without warning, changed direction at sharp angles. Not the wide, arcing turns of conventional aircraft, but abrupt shifts that seemed to ignore momentum. Some appeared to stop completely. hovering in place, before accelerating again with no visible transition. Others seemed to fade in and out, not disappearing behind clouds, but dimming or brightening in a way that suggested either distance changing very quickly or something about the light itself that did not behave in a steady way. These reports came from different people, in different places, across different years. Ranchers, truck drivers, hunters, individuals who spent long hours outdoors, under open sky, in conditions where observation was part of daily life. Many of them were familiar with aircraft, with satellites, with the ordinary patterns of movement above them. And yet, they described something that did not quite match those patterns. The official explanation accounts for a significant portion of these sightings. During the 1950s and 60s, aircraft like the U-2 flew at altitudes far beyond what most people had previously seen. At dusk, when the sun had set at ground level but still illuminated the upper atmosphere, these aircraft could appear as bright, fast-moving points of light against a darkening sky. From the ground, without context, they could look unusual. The A-12 and later the SR-71 introduced additional variables. Extreme speed, high altitude, flight paths that were not publicly known, under certain conditions, especially when viewed at a distance. These aircraft could produce visual effects that were difficult to interpret. Sudden changes in apparent speed, shifts in brightness, reflections that seemed to appear and vanish. Even the F-117, with its unconventional shape and radar-evading design, contributed to reports of unfamiliar objects in the sky. From this perspective, many sightings begin to make sense. Not as unknown objects, but as known objects seen without the information needed to identify them. And yet, there are details that remain. Pilots and aerospace engineers who have reviewed certain reports, particularly those involving trained observers, sometimes note that specific described maneuvers do not align easily with known aircraft performance, even accounting for experimental designs. Instant acceleration, abrupt directional changes without visible deceleration, stationary hovering followed by rapid movement. These are not characteristics typically associated with high-altitude reconnaissance planes or even advanced jet aircraft. There are, of course, other possibilities. Perception is not always precise, especially at distance. A light moving toward or away from an observer can appear to change speed dramatically. A turn that is gradual in three-dimensional space can appear sharp when projected against the flat background of the sky. Atmospheric conditions can distort light, creating effects that are difficult to interpret. Memory also plays a role. Accounts are often given after the fact, sometimes years later. Details can shift. Descriptions can become more defined over time, influenced by later experiences or by hearing similar stories from others. And still, the reports persist. Not identical, not perfectly consistent, but similar enough in certain features to form a recognizable pattern. Lights that move in ways that feel deliberate. Lights that do not behave quite like anything familiar. Lights that appear briefly and then are gone. It is possible that all of them can be explained, that each individual sighting, examined closely enough, would resolve into a combination of known factors, aircraft, atmospheric effects, perspective, and interpretation. That the sense of strangeness arises not from the objects themselves, but from the conditions under which they were observed. It is also possible that some small number of reports describe something less easily categorized, not necessarily extraterrestrial, not necessarily anything beyond the reach of human technology, but not immediately identifiable within the information available at the time. The difficulty lies in aggregation. When many reports are considered together, patterns emerge. But patterns can be shaped by selection, by which accounts are remembered, repeated, and recorded. The ordinary ones fade, the unusual ones remain, and so the question stays open. What were those lights? All of them? Some of them? Most of them? The official explanation provides a framework. It likely accounts for a large portion of what was seen. But it does not, for everyone, close the question entirely. And perhaps that is why the lights remain such a central part of the story. They are simple. No documents required, no technical background needed, just a point in the sky, moving in a way that makes you pause. And in that pause, a moment where the familiar slips slightly out of place, long enough to notice, not long enough to understand, and then gone.